I am delighted to introduce someone I have known and worked with for now more than 25 years. Uh, Former Senator Phil Gramm of Texas, former economics professor at Texas A&M University, uh, Phil Gramm, very former Democrat, Phil Gramm, more recently prominent Republican, more recently investment banker at UBS. Phil and I have one, I think it's fair to say, broad similarity, and one, I think it's fair to say, uh, dissimilarity of perspective. The dissimilarity is that Phil has a more individualist, more libertarian conception of the good society, and I have a more collective, more public sector, more redistributional element of concept of the good society. The similarity is that Phil and I both believe in the power of good-natured argument to get much closer to truth, believe there is such a thing as better and worse approximations to truth, and believe that while you're entitled to your opinions, you're not entitled to your facts, as Phil's senatorial colleague Pat Moynihan used to say, and believe in the power of economic reasoning and the power of data to help make things clearer. Phil has written a significant new book that is sharply critical of what he regards as a great deal of conventional wisdom about poverty, economic inequality, and opportunity in the United States. And I think it's fair to say that cuts rather strongly against the grain of some attitudes that are somewhat prevalent in the corridors of our school. And so I was delighted when he was prepared to come and speak about his work. Phil's going to talk about his major ideas for a little while. Then he and I are going to engage in what I'm sure will be good-natured and I hope will be informative discussion. And then we'll try to leave plenty of time for open discussion and to give Phil a chance to respond to comments and questions. And it's even conceivable that I'll want to chip in an observation or two at that stage. Senator Gramm.
Thank you, Larry. Well, let me first say that I'm honored to be here and I appreciate you coming. I had the opportunity to work with Larry when he was Secretary of the Treasury, and many important things got done because of my ability to work with Larry Summers. Larry has done something recently which is unusual in people who are in academics, but also in public life, and that is, based on principle, take on conventional wisdom in his own party. It's very hard to do, and it's very tempting to just be quiet. He's also proven right in the concerns that he raised. And so when you go against the normal pattern and you prove to be right and you show courage and intellect at the same time, you have an effect on people's opinion of you. And I think it is fair to say that as a result of all this, Larry Summers is the most credible economist in the American post-war period. So needless to say, I'm honored.
I did not pay him.
I
did not pay Phil to say this, and I did not invite him with the intent
I
he
didn't
would
say
say
he was
this.
the smartest economist. I just said he's the most credible. In any case, all right, so let me begin. And I talk slowly, as you've already discovered. So let me try to make my points quickly. For about 20 years, I have found myself marveling at how the fundamental economic statistics of the country seem to be at such great variance with the world that I live in. And I'll just give you an example. From 1947 to 1967, when the funding for the war on poverty started up, the poverty rate in America fell by 54%. Beginning in 1967, the poverty rate was basically unchanged for 50 years. It simply went back and forth, oscillated based on the state of the economy between about 16% and 11%. But yet, when you go back and look at all the transfer payments that are made by the federal, state, and local governments of the country, you find that in 1967, the average family in the bottom 20% of income earners got about $9,700 of transfers, and 50 years later, they were getting $45,400 of government transfers. And you ask yourself, how is it possible that the poverty rate fell so dramatically?
Those are in inflation-adjusted numbers.
That's inflation-adjusted dollars. Thank you. But basically, inflation-adjusted dollars, so we're talking about purchasing power dollars. So how is it possible that the poverty rate did not come down? The problem with the numbers has gotten so severe that in 2017, the Bureau of Labor Statistics put out data on how much Americans consumed, and the data is presented by quintiles. At the same time, the Census Bureau puts out household income by quintiles, and in 2017, the bottom 20% of households in America by income spent twice as much as their income. The second quintile spent 11% more than its income, and the top quintile spent only about half of its income. And yet there was no data to substantiate thrift rates at anything like that level. Bruce Meyer at the University of Chicago did a study of poverty and looked at what people consumed who were poor in 1980, and did the same study in 2017, and found that whereas the poverty rate was about 14% in 2017, that in terms of consumption, that only 2.7% of people in America were consuming at the level they did in 1980 in terms of basically the consumption of real goods and services. So how is all this possible? So what happened is I stumbled across a guy who is an applied statistician who twice was assistant commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics under two presidents. And we decided to go back and really look at the census numbers. And so what we found going back, the basic building block of statistics on well-being in America is household income. It's calculated by the census. They've been calculating it since 1947. And in 1947, very few payments were made in kind. Almost all payments were made in cash. And so the Census Bureau, because it was easier to calculate and it produced a good approximation, decided to count only cash payments as income. Now, they've made hundreds of decisions since that time, but they've never altered that fundamental decision. So that today, as remarkable as it sounds, the Census Bureau counts only about 1/3 of transfer payments as income to the people who receive the transfer payments. For people in the bottom 20% of income earners, they count only 12% of the transfer payments as income to people who receive the transfer payments. Now, what don't they count? They don't count food stamps, where you get a debit card and you go to the store and you buy food stamps and the government pays the bill. They don't count Medicaid, where government pays for your health care. They don't count rent subsidies, where government pays your rent. They don't count refundable tax credits, where you get a check from the Treasury because they take no account of taxes at any point along the income distribution. So when President Biden said, if we double the child tax credit, we will cut the poverty rate for children in half, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal saying you won't lower the poverty rate because they don't count refundable tax credits. And sure enough, the official number came out, the poverty rate didn't go down, and the Census Bureau was forced to put out a supplemental statement saying that if they had counted it, that the poverty rate would have gone down. So what does all this mean in terms of American well-being? The census says that the top 20% of recipients of income in America have income that is 16.7 times the bottom 20%. We show, using government data, because the census and other agencies collect all this data, using government data, we show that if you count all transfer payments as income to people who get the transfer payment, and this is net of the cost of the transfer, this is what they actually receive. If you count all taxes as income lost to the people that pay the taxes, that the ratio is not 16.7 to 1, but 4 to 1. Now, look, you can argue 4 to 1 is too much, but it's a very different debate than 16.7 to 1. We show if you count all transfer payments and taxes, that the poverty rate is actually about 2.5%. Now, this is interesting because Bruce Meyer at the University of Chicago did a study and found that on the basis of consumption, that the poverty rate was 2.7%. And he was looking at from 80 to 2017, we're looking at 67 to 2017, and yet our number is almost identical. You have all heard income inequality is a major problem in America, and it's growing. Senator Sanders says that the growth of income inequality in America is obscene and unsustainable. We find that if you count all transfer payments as income to people who got the transfer and taxes income lost to people who paid the taxes, that actually income inequality is lower today, very slightly lower than it was in 1947. So we're having a major debate about changing the economic system of the country based on the growth in inequality, which if you count all sources of income and taxes, didn't occur. Now, I know this is startling point to make, but I'll just make one other point. Two changes the census made in calculating what is called the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality. Two changes in the way they ask a question and the way they recorded the data explain in their numbers 42% of the growth in income inequality. Now, when they made the changes, they wrote extensively about how you weren't going to be able to compare the data before the change, the data after the change, but each new census, the explanation got smaller and smaller and deeper in the footnotes, and all the time, the census is doing a Gini coefficient. We find that the bottom 60% of Americans, when you count transfer payments and taxes, have very, very similar incomes. And of course, what has happened as the value of these transfer payments has exploded is that the work effort among the bottom 20% of American earners has collapsed from 68% of prime work age persons in the bottom 20% of income earners working down to 36%. And the amazing thing, as we show in the book, is if you look at what you get for working, the amazing thing is that 36% are working. We look at the causes of income, of earned income inequality, income you earn, and we find the biggest cause of income inequality is the decision to work or not work. The second cause is, as my mother would say, how sharp are your tools? How much education you have and how good is it? We look at the super rich. Who are these people? Do they pay their fair share of taxes? We find that the tax system is basically progressive up to $74 million a year. And then it dips for about 400 filers into the 30s. And these are people who give vast amounts of money away and earn most of their income through capital gains tax, which is treated differently. You look at mobility. If you're born and grow up in the bottom quintile, are you forever stuck there? 93% of people born and reared in the bottom quintile end up as adults in households that have higher income than their parents, and 63% of them move up to a higher quintile. And that's comparing them to their peers, the people that were growing up and the people that were adults. But if you compare them to their parents, the level of mobility is astounding. And the American dream is not that I'm going to do better than Larry Summers. The American dream is I'm going to do better than my mama. And by that measure, mobility is alive and well in America. We look at the last 50 years, much maligned. But in any other country in the world, it would be a golden age. 64% of Americans today have incomes that would have put them in the top quintile in terms of purchasing power 50 years ago. We try to stay away from politics and policy debate. And the argument is basically, we're not trying to end a debate, we're trying to start a debate. And our argument is we need to get our facts straight. And I wonder how far Bernie Sanders and I would be apart if he realized that it's as if he went to bed, had a dream that America was a socialist country, or at least redistributed massive amounts of wealth. He woke up, the dream had come true. Maybe we ought to be debating, do we need 100 welfare programs? Can we do this better? Is there a more efficient way to do it? How can we prevent people from dropping out of the labor market and therefore out of the economy and giving up the American dream in trying to help them? And I'll just conclude by saying that one of my frustrations in my 25 years in government is we never found a way to help people help themselves without destroying their incentive to help themselves. And maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I don't think people are happy that are not working. And I think we miss a lot of talent. We talk a lot in here about education and about how important it is. And I think there are a lot of talented people, especially in inner city schools, that are never discovered. So that's basically what the book is about.
Thank you for that very cogent and brisk summary. Let me ask one sort of broad gauge, cheap shot policy, political type question, and then we'll wallow a little bit in the details. And at some point, I'm going to call on my friend Bob Greenstein to ask a question or make a comment, because he has labored in the vineyards of policy in these areas for 40 years, having an enormous impact on outcomes. So, Phil, you say that, if I heard you right, and I think I did, that properly measured, you think the poverty rate has come down from 14 to 2.7, that 93% of bottom quintile Americans end up exceeding their parents, that we're really a pretty just society with the top 20% earning only 4 times as much as the bottom 20%, and that life's good. But it kind of feels to me, and maybe to some other people in the room, like you in your 25 years in government, the people you most admired who came before you, and the people who you most admire who came against you, mostly devoted their time in government to being against all these programs. They were against Medicare and Medicaid. They were against food stamp expansion. They're always quick to complain about expanding housing programs. They're ambivalent at best about some parts of the earned income credit. So didn't this happen kind of in spite of the policy perspective that you took? And maybe you should say, God, thank God for LBJ and the war on poverty. And wasn't the Great Society terrific? And last time I checked, there weren't any Democrat, no Democrat has ever said we fought on a war on poverty and poverty won. But that talking point in some form has been uttered by 80% of Republican politicians. So isn't this an act of apostasy far greater than anything I ever did as an act of apostasy when I talked about inflation?
No. Let me say, first of all, that if the objective of the war on poverty was to eliminate poverty, it was an overwhelming success. In fact, I would go further.
Wasn't that the objective? Isn't that why they called it the war on poverty?
It was an overwhelming success if the objective was to eliminate poverty by giving people things. But I would just simply say that that was not the stated objective. The stated objective by Lyndon Johnson was to make it possible for people to take care of themselves. And so in terms of eliminating want, we've succeeded in that. In fact, the The 2.7 or 2.5% of the people who are now really poor in America have fallen through the cracks of this system because of mental illness or because of drug abuse. And no matter how much money you put into food stamps or rent subsidies, you're not reaching these people. These are people that can be reached only by figuring out what their problem is and helping them. So is this a success? It is if your objective was to eliminate want, if your objective was to elevate people and give them the ability to eliminate their own poverty. I think it failed. And I can't miss saying this. I once said to my mama that we were fortunate that there was no welfare program like this when I was growing up, because if there had been, I wouldn't be here. And my mama said, well, what do you mean? I would have never taken welfare. And I said, well, mother, everybody you would have known would have been taking welfare. People would have laughed at you for not taking welfare. The agriculture department would have come to see you and said, you know, you're hurting your community by not taking welfare. You would have taken it. My mother said, if you ever say that I would have taken welfare, I'll denounce you. But she would have, and our lives would have been different. So it's a success, and yet it's a terrible failure. And if we could get the success without the failure, then I think we would have a true success. So yes, in a sense, I'm saying it worked. But in another sense, I'm saying it didn't work. But the fact that it worked, I think, means that we ought to be trying to make it work better and eliminate the negative parts and do it more efficiently.
So let's separate two major strands in your argument, because I think they're logically quite separable, and they were separable in your presentation. One part of it is you claim that there's these big gaps between the conventional wisdom and the facts as you presented, and you kind of accuse the statistical authorities and the governments generally of portraying a substantially misleading picture. That's part one of your argument. And part two of your argument, which is the part you just emphasized, is that actually, while they've reduced material poverty, these programs have been quite problematic on culture of dependency type grounds.
Moynihan thought that.
So I want to just separate those two pieces, because I think we may not agree on that. We probably agree that it can be separated into those two pieces,
sure.
even if we don't agree on them.
Well, let me just respond to the first one by saying that we stay way away from imputing motive.
That's fair.
I don't know why they did it the way, I know why they did it in 47, and it made perfectly good sense. And it was about a 97% accurate measure. But what happened after 47 is that with all these new welfare programs, almost every new program was a payment in kind that wasn't counted. And so I don't know why it happened. And we don't try to get into that. We just try to say it did happen. We need to recognize it and then debate what we do now.
So we may be able to get through this part of it very quickly. As I understand it, and I think I understand this at least reasonably well, the census publishes the poverty line and the poverty rate and the inequality statistics that you're focused on. And they also publish another set of statistics called the supplemental statistics. And those supplemental statistics, which they published long before the before the Biden child credit, those supplemental poverty statistics may not exactly match yours, but they show very dramatic reductions in poverty and all that. So if the world shifted a focus to the supplemental statistics, as I understand it, you would have at least two further quibbles or debates, and I think they are debates. One is, if I'm on Medicaid and I need a kidney transplant and I get a kidney transplant and the kidney transplant costs $150,000, you could say I just got kind of given $150,000 and so I'm rich. But you could kind of see how somebody could see that event a little differently than I'm rich because I got $150,000. So there's at least a question as to how one should value the Medicaid piece.
Let me before then, because I'll forget.
Yes, Jason's going to correct me.
Yeah,
yes,
go ahead.
Please.
So the supplemental poverty measure does not actually count the value of Medicaid. It counts the value of SNAP. I can tell that. Supplemental poverty
measure does count the value of your food benefits, your housing benefits, all of that. For medical care, it does something different. It says they're going to subtract from your income anything you pay out of pocket on healthcare. And so if you didn't have Medicaid before and you had a $10,000 bill and now you get Medicaid and you only have a $1,000 bill, your income goes down by less.
Yeah. Well, let me,
Okay.
I'm going to forget. Here's the thing. Remember, Larry, that I'm old. And so when you give me a bunch of questions, I forget some of them. So I don't want to forget this one. So let me just say, the way we value Medicaid is what was the average expenditure on Medicaid as an approximation of what the policy would have cost you had you bought it. If you've got a $2 million Medicaid bill, we don't say your income was $2 million. Your income was what buying the policy to cover it would have cost. Now, you can say that maybe it's not worth what it cost. And that's a debate that I make it clear in the book we ought to be having. Are these programs worth it? But secondly, Medicaid, they're just paying, government just pays 70% of the cost. So the other cost is paid by your private health insurance because we're subsidizing Medicaid. So, and I'm not trying to interrupt you, it's just I forget. I want to.
So just to maybe sharpen this slightly, could somebody from the people who know all this stuff on the better than I, not better than you do, but better than I do. If you use, Phil says the poverty rate, if you do it right, according to him, is 2.7%. If you do the poverty line according to the supplemental poverty rate, what's the poverty line? What's the poverty rate?
I don't know. Yeah. Well,
wait,
let me
so
say
2 points. So what's the, so Phil says 2.7, and even with the one you like, you say 11. So what accounts for the difference between the 2.7 and the 11?
what's counted. And let me just say, on the supplemental thing, the problem with supplement, there's no supplemental Gini curve. So there are a bunch of other problems, but here's the problem. The census deals with criticism by putting out supplemental measures, but the one that is used in the public policy debate is the official number. And all I'm saying is I just want to get the numbers straight so that when we're debating the same thing. We're not talking past each other.
I'm going to call on, if I might, I'm going to call on Bob. And what I want to clarify for a minute is the extent to which, if we just started using the supplemental number rather than the official number, and that was entirely clear to everybody, and it was entirely clear to everybody that that was being used, we would have addressed your concerns versus the concerns that the supplemental number, and we used it in the Gini coefficient and in the inequality discussions and all that, versus the concerns that even the way they do the supplemental poverty measure doesn't make enough corrections of a kind that you think are appropriate. I just want to get that issue clear. So I'm going to call on Bob and then give you a full chance to respond. Bob.
So as someone who's worked in this area for 40, 50 years, I think your critique of the official poverty measure is right on target. But when I read your book, I was really troubled that maybe I read it too fast. I didn't find an acknowledgement in the book that the supplemental poverty measure exists. Even in your remarks here today, you said, well, census was forced, your word, to put out a supplemental statement about if the child tax credit had counted. But that's not really entirely right. The Census Bureau for about 15 years has every year issued alongside each other the official poverty rate measure and the supplemental poverty rate. We should note that the supplemental poverty measure is based on a 1995 set of recommendations of an expert panel of the National Academy of Sciences that was highly critical of the official poverty measure and recommended the supplemental poverty measure. And I think contrary to what you just said, again, as someone who works every day on this stuff, I have seen over the last 5 years a sea change where the mainstream media, growing numbers of Hill staff and others use the SPM, the supplemental poverty measure, rather than the official poverty measure. When I wrote pieces, when other analysts wrote pieces, when Joe Biden said, it wasn't Joe Biden, that the 2021 child tax credit expansion would reduce child poverty by about, we were all explicit that we were using the supplemental poverty measure. When Jason DeParle did a front page story of the New York Times last summer on a big reduction in child poverty, he was explicit. He used the supplemental poverty measure. So I just, your critique is right on the OPM. But let me finish. But I wish you had acknowledged the SPM, and as Larry has said, if you don't think the SPM is right, explain why. But there's, to answer your question, Larry, a couple of key additional things about why does the SPM have a significantly higher poverty rate than your measure? For starters, the question is not only what you count, but where you set the poverty line. The National Academy of Sciences expert panel concluded that they were changing the whole concept of poverty measurement by counting all in-kind benefits except Medicare and Medicaid. The SPM does that. Taxes, you're absolutely right. They subtract taxes paid. They do all of that. It was a change in the concept, and they, as a result, had a different concept for setting the poverty line. And under the SPM, it's a bit higher than under the OPM, which is one reason why the poverty rate's lower under the SPM, but it's not, it doesn't fall to the same degree. But the second big issue is what to do, as you said, about Medicare and Medicaid. Now, you made it sound reasonable just now when you said we just count the premium value. But
well, that's what we did.
That's what you did. No, I'm talking about what you did. But let's be clear what that means. What the premium value means is you add up all of the expenditures for the year in Medicare and all of the expenditures for the year in Medicaid, you divide it by the number of beneficiaries, and you assign the result as income to everyone. So yes, the guy with the kidney transplant doesn't get $100,000 counted, but everybody in the country gets something counted because of his kidney transplant. And the point that I want to make, and I would argue that your measure in a very different way is problematic like the OPM is, but for a different reason. And that is that you use the official poverty measure line and you count Medicare and Medicaid against it. But the poverty line used in the official measure is based on a concept that doesn't count Medicare and Medicaid as income. And if you count them as income, then I think you need to rethink how and where do you set the poverty line to count them against it. Final quick point. People working less or more. If you look at the changes in the US safety net over the last 30 years, what stands out is how much we have cut assistance for people who aren't elderly or disabled and don't have earnings, and that how much we have increased assistance for working families that make low wages. For every 100 families with kids below the poverty line, 82 got cash welfare 40 years ago. Today, it's only 23. We've really cut cash welfare sharply and emphasized support for working families. So some of the changes made in the safety net actually fit with what you're recommending. And the argument that we vastly expanded purchasing power for people who have no other income. We've given them more food stamps and they have healthcare coverage, but we've actually reduced the amount of straight cash they get if they don't work.
Well, a whole bunch of issues, and let me respond to them. We do talk about the supplemental measure, but let me begin by just discussing in the public debate that occurs politically in this country, the number that is used is the official measure. I have never seen the supplemental measure referred to in the Wall Street Journal, except when I have referred to it in the article about Biden cutting or raising the child tax credit. So one of the things we argue in the book, in the conclusion, is that the census should be required to adjust the official number so that we're all talking about the same thing. Now, I'm not arguing that people who specialize in this area and who know this area are unaware that there are problems with the census number. When Jason was at the Council of Economic Advisors, President Obama in his economic message mentioned that census undercounts benefits. The problem is that all of that gets lost in the public policy debate. And we need to have a number that is agreed to so that, again, we can have a real debate and all be talking about the same thing. Maybe the supplemental number includes refundable tax credits. I'm not sure.
It does.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, and in the article I wrote in the Wall Street Journal, I talk about the supplemental report. And in the book, in the conclusion, we talk that the response of the census, if this does force a national debate, will be to put out a supplemental measure. That'll be their response. But the point is, what is the purpose of the supplemental measure? In some sense, you could argue that by having the supplemental measure, you don't adjust the measure that everybody uses in public policy debate. So I'm not saying it is an effort to confuse, but that's the result that it produces. In terms of Medicaid, I don't know how else you would value it other than what you would have to pay for a policy that gives you that coverage. You can't say that Medicaid is worthless. We argue in the book that we know it's not worth zero, but we don't argue that it's necessarily worth the cost. We say that's something that should be debated. We don't know of a way to value it other than the transfer cost, but I think that's something that we need to debate. But it is not a debate that anybody has wanted to have that I've talked to about it, because to say that it's not worth it, then the question is, well, if it's not worth what it costs, why are we doing it? Let's see. So again, I'm not saying in the book that they're not people who have spent their lives studying these problems, that they don't know that many of these problems exist. I'm saying that in the public policy debate that is setting the laws of this country, that the official numbers are being used. And a perfect example is the sociologist at Princeton who just came out with a new book. It's the #3 seller among nonfiction books in America. And he uses only where he uses any numbers, he uses the official number. And so what I'm trying to do is get the facts straight.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to summarize what we just did and slightly change the topic. It sounds to me like there is clear agreement that the official poverty line substantially overstates poverty. It sounds to me,
And income inequality.
and the corresponding measures would substantially overstate income inequality. It sounds like there is a differences in view, which are not the most important question, on how widely and how universally that is understood and promulgated, with Phil feeling that it's not generally understood and not generally promulgated, others who are closer to the field feeling that it's more out there and more prevalently understood. And I would kind of comment, as someone who's a consumer of these debates, my view is probably somewhere in between where Phil and Bob are. And it sounds like there's a good question for students to think about and work on, which is how to think about the Medicaid and the medical care benefit, which I think we can all agree is probably in a somewhat different category than when you get a refundable tax credit. But if we kind of run a country where providing a benefit to a family of four costs, providing reasonable health insurance to a family of four costs $25,000, and we give that to a family under four, we probably need to at least hesitate to think that that's taken them halfway or more to being under poverty. And that's a complicated issue to think about. But in some ways, Phil, the more striking part of what you believe and what you say is that to some extent has been embraced, as Bob points out, in the public policy debate, is you feel that there's very substantial induced dependency associated with unconditional cash transferring, and to people who have low incomes, and that even if it produces high measured cash incomes, it is very costly in terms of what it does. And I think others feel that that's part of what a decent society says. So how do you think our society should deal with? I'm going to describe a case that must exist a fair amount in America. A woman has been abandoned by the father of her children. The father is not working in the legal economy, so he is not paying child support. He's not in substantial contact with the woman and her children. And the woman has two children, one of whom is 7 and one of whom is 3. How do you believe our society should deal with that situation? Do you believe that woman should be forced to work full time? Do you believe somebody should apply a test to see whether her mother is or is not available to take care of her children? And if so, then she has to work full time. If not, then maybe it's okay for her not to work because paying for childcare is going to be very expensive. How would you propose that the society you want to create deal with the hypothetical that I just described?
Well, let me first say that it's dealt with it to some extent in the Clinton welfare reform bill, in that it applied only to aid to families with dependent children. And I think it is very important to note that even though that work requirement has been waived over and over and over again and never applied in many jurisdictions like the District of Columbia, the labor force participation rate of women with children is higher than other type than the participation rates of other people who qualify for poverty programs. In other words, it worked and it had a permanent effect, and it's the most significant public policy debate in terms of changing public behavior in my political career. Now, the way I would deal with it, if people said to me, well, you just give me your program. Well, my program would be that you've got a choice. And if you can't find somebody to take care of your children, then you have got to begin a program where first you're going to have to become literate to continue to get the program, and then you're going to have to do a GED, and then you're going to have to begin specific training, and when your children reach a certain age, you're going to have to begin to work in order to get the program.
Let me understand, have to. Let's say I have to become literate.
Well,
Okay.
and if you don't,
And I'm, by the way, I'm probably in a program that's run by the government. You might not think the government was so great at running literacy programs,
right.
given what you
No.
generally think about
Yeah.
the government.
no, that's
But
right.
leave that aside. I, quote, have to become literate.
Well,
Let's
you
suppose
said-
I don't.
Well, we had the law was written.
I had a gym teacher who
during
told
the
me I had
Clinton-
to climb a rope up 20
okay.
feet.
Yeah, okay.
It didn't happen.
Well, look, it didn't say you had to climb the rope. It just said you had to do it to pass the course. So maybe you didn't pass the course. But the Clinton welfare reform bill said there were certain conditions you had to meet or you lost your welfare. Okay.
Let's say I lose my welfare. What happens to my 6-year-old again?
Huh?
So I don't do good on the conditions. I do bad on the
Yeah,
conditions.
you lose.
I don't manage to learn to read. It's really bad.
Yeah,
Okay.
well, you
So
don't-
I lose my welfare. The hell with
That's
me. I didn't learn to read.
well, look.
What happens to my 3-year-old child again when I've lost my welfare
Well-
because I didn't do this?
The law passed when Bill Clinton signed the law that had a work requirement, and it worked. People left the program. They got jobs. They never came back. So I'm saying that what I would do with young dependent children is set up valuable benchmarks that the person had to meet in order to maintain the benefit. You know, God didn't decree she get the benefit. It's a benefit we decided.
I just want to understand
provide.
about the 3-year-old.
Yeah, I want
when
to- yeah,
mom
look,
doesn't qualify
We're
for the
not-
benefit.
Look,
I want to understand, is your view, well, it's going to be grim for that 3-year-old, but
Larry,
because we're doing it,
look.
then it's all going to work out for the best because most
We
of the
can-
moms will work?
Yeah,
I just
well,
want to
look,
understand your philosophy on
Okay, well, I'm gonna give you my philosophy. We have an obligation to take care of the 6-year-old, but we don't have an obligation to provide benefits to a person who's not trying to help themselves, okay? And so if we're going to take the view, the problem, and I know this is partly academic on our part, but if we take the view that we can't do anything that might harm anybody or put a strain on somebody, then we're never going to deal with a problem. I think we have got to find a workable work requirement. When you're giving people almost $50,000 a year of benefits, if you don't have a requirement that they work, many of them, and in the case now, 64% of prime work age persons in the bottom 20% of income earners don't work. And the ones that do work generally don't work full time. So if you want to get them into the labor market, you've got to have some kind of work requirement at that level. And I would say, look, getting them in the labor market is not cruel and unusual punishment. It's where opportunity is. The economy is an escalator, and if you don't get on the escalator, you don't move up. You don't learn the skills you have. And so maybe this is tough, but it's tough love. I don't think that people are happy or fulfilled, and certainly the country is not benefited by having people who don't work, who are able-bodied and of prime work age.
Okay, well, the floor is open for questions. Bob, I think you had your chance. I'm going to call on Jason. Jason, go to the mic.
Senator, terrific presentation. When you look at these numbers, I think the heart of the disagreement between people who have a more liberal perspective and conservative perspective is the liberals say if you took away all these benefits, keep everyone's income the same, now everyone falls below the poverty line and it's awful. You say take away these benefits, but now people are going to earn more, and so they're going to go, above the poverty line. So how do you assess that? I think is the nub of the debate. I want to give 3 arguments on the liberal side of the debate and see what you think of them. Argument number 1, a number of the programs we have actually probably encourage people to work and help their mobility, whether that's the earned income tax credit you were talking about, which encourages work, maybe investing in preschool, and even some economic research that finds you give families support today, whether for food or something else, and their children learn better, and so they do better 20 years from now. So these things actually help income. That's argument number 1. Argument number 2 is that whatever bad things you think about marginal tax rates now, families at the bottom, getting, losing 50% of their money, that was actually worse before. Charles Murray was sort of right when he said there were 100% marginal tax rates where you earned $1 and you lost $1. There's a lot less of that now, in part because of Charles Murray and you and the like. And then the third is just a sort of simple comparison to Europe, where all of this is much worse from your perspective, but the labor force participation rate for prime age workers is actually higher in Europe than it is in the United States. So maybe we're right that if we took these programs away, incomes would stay the same. Maybe even incomes would go down if we took some of these programs away.
Well, let me say, Jason, first of all, I haven't tried to argue here that we need to get rid of these programs. I've just said that we need to count them in looking at where we are and what we have achieved and how much resources we're spending and how much we've transferred to people. And having counted them, then we need to pose the questions, are they worth it? Could we have done it better? And then you've got the question about incentive. Not all these programs are created equal. The earned income tax credit, if applied correctly, can be a positive factor because you're saying to people who have marginal skills or very little skill that if you put forth an effort, we're going to supplement your wage. And it's obviously more effective than minimum wage, where you cut off the bottom rung of the ladder. So I guess I would say that we need to do more things like earned income tax credit. I think it ought to apply only to full-time work, but that's debatable. But we need to find ways to incentivize people to work with phase-out rates on these programs. But the problem with phase-out, and I've looked at them, and I've been inclined toward them in my political career, but that was before I realized how big the transfer is. You're now already in a position where on a per capita basis, the bottom 50% of the 60% of the population has basically the same income. And if you do a phase out, you're going to be putting people who took the benefits in the 4th quintile, whereas the people who worked are in the middle quintile. So I think in the end, you're going to have some form of work requirement or education requirement until they can work. And look, I take seriously the fact that because of remote learning, that we can really, that a person that's got dependent children can learn a tremendous amount while they're taking care of their children and enhance their capacity to work in the marketplace. Let me also say, I was raised by my grandmother. Okay, my mama became a practical nurse, and she worked in the hospital from 7 to 3, and then she worked for people that had private care from 3 to 7, 3 to 11. But my grandmother raised me. And so I don't know how many families can do that or would do that. You either did that or you didn't make it when I was growing up. Okay, maybe that's too hard a world, but it does produce some positive results. That's all I'm saying.
Other questions or comments? Why don't you go to a mic?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Senator and Professor. Very quick question. How useful is to focus on wealth, a tax on wealth, and focus on wealth inequality? I know there are two sides of the debates. Professor Somers had written about it, but is this an option? What do you think about it?
Well, I'm not worried. Let me address the issue in several ways. First of all, I am struck by the fact that income inequality in America is driven primarily by working wage, salary, income. You have to get up to about $20 million a year in income before most income in the average in the categories comes from wealth. So if you want more income equality, it's got to come from skills. Wealth accumulation is something you want to encourage for society. And I make the argument in the book, which has been criticized, that, and I take Warren Buffett as a perfect example. Warren Buffett is really rich. And he lives, he's never bought a new car. He lives in a nice house, but a modest house. He pays himself a nice salary, but a modest salary, and he rarely sells anything. So you could ask, what good is his wealth doing him? I don't know. Obviously, he likes keeping score. He's like Scrooge, okay? But what good is it doing America? It's doing America a lot of good. It's funding the investments that are making America go. And I find it difficult to accept the argument that we would be better off taking his wealth and having government spend it than we are having him invest it. And, you know, I look at somebody like Bill Gates, and he's really rich. But he owns only 7% of Microsoft. And the 401ks, IRAs, public and private pension funds, insurance policies own 73% of the rest. So I'm not troubled by the fact that he's rich. I wish I were that rich, but I'm not poor because he's richer. And I don't want to get government in the business of this. Every society that I have looked at that has made a major effort to redistribute wealth has destroyed a lot more than they've created. So, it's important for people to understand two other things. One, we have the most progressive income tax system in the world by far. And the second thing is, if you took all the income of all the billionaires in America, you would have trouble funding the government for a week. So there are just not that many of them. So I'm cold on the idea of taking people's wealth.
Right. Just 1 second. Just to comment on that, I'm probably 70% of the way towards you from Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren on that question. But I think in fairness, when Warren Buffett buys Coca-Cola stock for 20 and the stock goes to 200 and he picks good stock because he's a smart guy and he's sitting there with the stock at 200, that would feel to a lot of people like income. And the same intellectual effort, that same kinds of effort that you're at great pains to do to keep track of every bit of earning and every bit of cash that a poor person gets. Some people would say you should do the same thing with respect to Warren Buffett.
Well, let
And
me respond though.
unrealized capital gains have some significant character of income. And the way our law works and the way you kept voting to keep it, I thought that at a minimum, that when Warren Buffett died and his child inherited that Coca-Cola stock that was now at 200, and his child sold the Coca-Cola stock for 250, that the child should have to pay a capital gain of 230, not a capital gain of just 50. And you and your allies regard that as theft and as some terrible injustice against the American way. And just the idea that you don't completely escape the tax forever, eternally by dying. Why do you guys regard that as?
Yeah, well, let me
and as
respond.
some kind of attack?
Okay, first of
Seems
all,
kind of unreasonable.
there is a big difference between Warren Buffett having an unrealized capital gain and government giving people money. People are not giving him money. He's making the money. He is creating the wealth. So I don't see any comparison between paying welfare benefits and Warren Buffett having capital gains. Secondly, I think I would have no problem if we decided to tax all capital gains at death or have a death tax at death. It's doing both that I'm opposed to. I would, if I had to choose between the two, I would take the death tax for myself rather than, because the step up in basis is a powerful thing. I'm not sure, Switzerland doesn't tax capital gains, doesn't have a death tax. You know, in an ideal world, probably I'd be dishonest to say I don't think we should either, but we shouldn't have both. And we need to come to grips with it. But again, I just want to make the point that don't get the idea that if we took Warren Buffett's wealth, we're going to solve all these problems. There's just not enough wealth out there to make any difference. And you're not going to affect Warren Buffett's behavior. He's doing what he's doing because he's keeping score. He's like Scrooge. And God bless him, because he's helping America more by making the money than he'll ever help it by giving it away. But you're going to affect a lot of people's willingness to continue working. I work, I lie and tell people I got a young wife and she wants money and she makes me work. But I like working, but I would not work if you were going to deny me the step up in basis and make me pay the 40% death tax. I don't know what I'd do. I'd probably die of boredom or get in trouble or something. But anyway, enough said. Yeah.
Michael Schwartzman. I'm a retired hedge fund manager, and I will answer your question. Indeed, the carried interest deduction should be eliminated, and it's a shame.
Carried interest deduction?
Yeah, well, it's similar to what you were discussing, but that's just arose now. Did you ever consider, and I've seen those discussions many times, usually in papers with your co-author, that conflating the notion of poverty and whether we have beat the poverty, etc., with the notion of income inequality is methodologically poor approach. After all, inequality, as defined by you, and I disagree with those definitions, genies and etc., could have existed if everybody was, let's say, like Buffett, and everybody else was like professors at this university. The inequality would have still existed. Poverty would have ceased to exist. So I'm a conservative. And there are two of us here, and that's why I wore the tie. And people thought that I was you until they spoke to me and realized that no way in the United States I could have gotten this accent. But otherwise, you probably by now should consider that the framework of income inequality that you and your co-authors, because you often publish with co-authors, is itself methodologically weak. You constantly fiddle with the adjustments. They are subjective. Your opposition, the liberal opposition, if they identify themselves as liberal, fiddles with the same adjustments. And this debate, and we're both, quote, old, has been going on for 30 years.
Yeah.
There has to be a different approach.
Well, look, people totally misjudge America by saying it's a measure of America's failure that you have income inequality. America never promised equality of outcome. It promised, in Abraham Lincoln's words, a fair chance and an open way to use your industry and intellect. And then depending on what you got and what you use, you're going to produce vastly different results. But what America did promise is the fair chance and open way. And there are a lot of things we can do in terms of public policy, especially in areas like work requirement and improving primary and secondary education, that can open up the playing field of life to a lot of people. And I'm convinced that in inner city schools, there is a lot of talent that is undiscovered, and we're poorer for it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we are
Over our
at the
time.
end of the hour, so I am simply going to remark on how interesting a session this has been, how I have been stimulated to think about a variety of things by the things you said. I think the thing that I'm going to take away longest is a desire to understand better the effects for good or for ill, the feasibility for good or for ill of various kinds of work requirements, and when they're actually imposed in practice, what actually happens, how to think about them as a policy tool. But you have given us a lot to think about. You've given us a powerful example of thoughtful advocacy. We admire someone 20 years out of the United States Senate who is pushing away at alternative statistical measures and the like, and agree or disagree, you continue to make a substantial contribution to our country. Thank you, Senator and Professor.
Thank you. Thank you.